He was just doing his job, a routine traffic stop on a quiet Tuesday night. The red Honda had been speeding through downtown, nothing major, just enough to warrant pulling them over. Officer Mike Santos had done this 1,000 times before: flash the lights, approach the vehicle, write the ticket, move on. Simple. Clean. Safe. Until the driver rolled down his window, heard his voice, and everything from his past 3 years came crashing back in 5 terrifying words: "I know that voice, cop." Welcome to Silent Heroes. Before we begin this intense story of hidden identities, dangerous secrets, and the thin blue line that protects us all, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes work in shadows to keep us safe, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who risk everything in silence. The traffic stop happened at 11:47 p.m. on Maple Street, just outside the warehouse district where legitimate businesses closed early and other kinds of commerce took over after dark. Santos had been patrolling this beat for 8 months now, ever since his transfer from narcotics. 8 months of routine calls, domestic disputes, and traffic violations. 8 months of trying to forget everything that came before. The Honda Civic wasn't particularly suspicious, maybe 10 miles over the speed limit, tinted windows that were legal but dark enough to make you look twice. Santos ran the plates through dispatch, clean record, no warrants, registered to a Maria Gonzalez in East Cleveland. Routine stuff. He approached the driver's side with the casual confidence of someone who had done this hundreds of times. Left hand on his radio, right hand free but ready, eyes scanning the interior of the car as he walked up. Standard procedure drilled into every cop from day one: stay alert, stay alive, but don't escalate unless you have to. "Evening," Santos said, stopping just behind the driver's door. "License and registration, please. I clocked you doing 42 in a 35 zone back there." The driver was a young Hispanic male, maybe 25, wearing a Lakers jersey and gold chain. Nothing immediately threatening, but Santos noted the way his hands gripped the steering wheel a little too tight, the way his eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror. Nervous, but that wasn't unusual. Most people got nervous when they saw red and blue lights. "Yeah, okay, officer," the driver said, reaching slowly for his glove compartment. "Just trying to get home, you know? Long day at work." Santos nodded, beginning to relax. This was going to be a simple speeding ticket, nothing more. The driver handed over his license: Carlos Mendez, 26, clean record according to the quick mental check Santos was running based on the name and address. Everything normal. "Mr. Mendez," Santos said, looking at the license, "I'm going to write you a citation for speeding. Keep it under 35 through downtown, especially this time of night. Lot of pedestrians around here don't pay attention." That should have been the end of it. Santos should have walked back to his patrol car, written the ticket, handed it over, and watched the Honda drive away into the night. Instead, something in Carlos Mendez's posture changed. His shoulders tensed, his head tilted slightly, and when he looked up at Santos, there was a recognition in his eyes that made the officer's blood run cold. "Wait a minute," Mendez said slowly, his voice taking on a different quality, harder, more focused. "I know that voice." Santos felt every muscle in his body tighten. Years of training kicked in automatically: assess the threat, control the situation, call for backup if necessary. But this wasn't a standard threat assessment. This was something much more dangerous: exposure. "I'm sorry," Santos said, keeping his voice steady and professional. "I think you might be mistaken, sir." But Carlos Mendez was staring at him now with the intensity of someone putting together pieces of a puzzle that had been bothering him for months. His eyes moved from Santos's face to his badge number, then back to his face, and Santos could practically see the wheels turning in his head. "No, no, no," Mendez said, shaking his head slowly. "I definitely know that voice. You're—" He paused, and Santos could see the exact moment when recognition hit him like a physical blow. "You're Miguel Rodriguez." The name hit Santos like a punch to the gut. Miguel Rodriguez, the identity he'd worn for 3 years, the face he'd shown to some of the most dangerous people in the city, the man who had earned the trust of drug dealers, gang members, and cartel operators through months of careful work and constant danger. Miguel Rodriguez, who was supposed to be dead and buried along with the operation that had consumed 3 years of his life. "Sir, I think you have me confused with someone else," Santos said, but he could hear the slight tremor in his own voice. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." Carlos Mendez laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Step out of the vehicle? Miguel, you used to buy kilos from my cousin Eddie. You came to my sister's quinceañera. You were at my apartment playing dominoes just last year." His voice got louder, more agitated. "What the hell are you doing in a cop uniform?" Santos's hand moved instinctively toward his radio. This was escalating fast, and he needed backup. But calling for help would create a scene, and a scene would mean questions. Questions would mean explanations. And explanations would mean that 3 years of the most dangerous undercover work in the department's history would be blown wide open. "Mr. Mendez," Santos said firmly, "I'm going to need you to calm down and step out of the vehicle. Now." But Carlos Mendez wasn't listening anymore. He was pulling out his cell phone, his fingers moving rapidly across the screen. "Eddie's not going to believe this," he said, almost to himself. "Miguel Rodriguez is a cop. Miguel Rodriguez has been a cop this whole time." That's when Santos realized that this traffic stop had just become the most dangerous moment of his career. Because Miguel Rodriguez hadn't just bought drugs and played dominoes. Miguel Rodriguez had gathered intelligence that had led to 17 arrests, the seizure of over $2 million in narcotics, and the dismantling of one of the city's largest drug distribution networks. Miguel Rodriguez had sent people to prison. People with friends. People with family. People who would kill a cop without hesitation if they knew what he had done. And now Carlos Mendez was about to tell them exactly who Officer Mike Santos really was. Santos watched in horror as Carlos Mendez's thumb hovered over his phone screen, ready to send a message that would destroy everything. 3 years of careful work, countless hours building trust with people who killed for lesser betrayals, and months of testimony that had put dangerous men behind bars, all of it was about to unravel because of a routine traffic stop. "Carlos," Santos said, dropping the formal tone and speaking the name he'd heard 100 times in Eddie Mendez's apartment. "Don't do this." Mendez looked up from his phone, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and anger. "Don't do what? Tell people that the guy who was supposed to be family turned out to be a snitch? Tell them that Miguel Rodriguez, who ate at our table and played with our kids, was wearing a wire the whole time?" "It wasn't like that," Santos said, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew how hollow they sounded. Because in some ways, it had been exactly like that. The job required building relationships, earning trust, becoming someone people would confide in. The fact that those relationships were false didn't make the betrayal feel any less real to the people who had lived it. "Then what was it like, Miguel?" Mendez's voice was getting louder, more emotional. "Because my cousin Eddie is doing 15 years because of evidence you gathered. My neighbor Rosa lost her house because her son got arrested in your operation. Half the guys from the block are in prison or dead because of information you gave the police." Santos could see other cars starting to slow down, drivers curious about the police car with its lights flashing and the increasingly animated conversation happening beside it. He needed to end this quickly, but every option seemed to lead to disaster. "Carlos, listen to me," Santos said, lowering his voice and hoping to de-escalate the situation. "I know you're angry. I know this feels like a betrayal. But there are people's lives at stake here. If you send that message, if you tell people who I really am, it doesn't just hurt me. It puts other officers in danger. It puts you in danger." "Me in danger?" Mendez laughed bitterly. "I'm not the one who spent 3 years lying to people who would kill me if they found out the truth. I'm not the one who built a career on destroying my own community." The accusation stung because there was truth in it. Santos had spent countless sleepless nights wrestling with the moral complexity of his assignment. He'd watched good people get caught up in bad situations, seen families destroyed by arrests that he'd helped make possible. But he'd also seen what the drug trade was doing to the neighborhood, the violence, the addiction, the way it poisoned everything it touched. "Those drugs were killing kids, Carlos," Santos said. "The violence was tearing apart families. Someone had to do something." "Someone had to do something," Mendez repeated mockingly. "So you decided to play God. You decided who deserved to go to prison and who deserved to stay free. You decided that lying to people who trusted you was justified because you were the good guy." Santos felt his radio crackle to life. "Unit 247, what's your status on that traffic stop? You've been out there for 15 minutes. He keyed the radio quickly. "Unit 247, everything's fine. Just finishing up the paperwork." But everything wasn't fine. Carlos Mendez was still holding his phone, and Santos could see that he'd typed out a message. All it would take was one press of the send button, and within hours, everyone in the drug trade would know that Miguel Rodriguez was actually a police officer. The people he'd helped put in prison would put contracts out on his life. The people still on the street would be looking for revenge. And anyone who had ever been seen talking to Miguel Rodriguez would become a target for associating with a snitch. "Carlos," Santos said, trying one more time. "I know you hate me right now. I know you feel betrayed. But if you send that message, you're not just exposing me. You're putting your sister in danger. Your cousin's wife. Anyone who was ever seen with Miguel Rodriguez is going to be suspected of cooperating with police." For the first time, Mendez hesitated. His thumb stopped moving over the phone screen, and Santos could see him thinking through the implications of what he was about to do. They trusted you, Mendez said quietly. My family trusted you. You came to birthday parties. You held my niece when she was a baby. You were at my grandmother's funeral. And the whole time, you were gathering evidence to put us in prison. Santos felt the weight of every meal he'd shared, every joke he'd laughed at, every moment of genuine connection he'd felt with people he was ultimately betraying. The job had required him to become someone else, but somewhere along the way, parts of Miguel Rodriguez had become real. The grief he'd felt at that funeral had been genuine. The affection he'd developed for some of these families had been authentic, even if his identity wasn't. I know, Santos said simply. I know what I did. I know what it cost, and I know what it's still costing. But Carlos, sending that message won't bring Eddie back from prison. It won't undo what happened. It'll just create more victims. Mendez stared at him for a long moment, phone still in his hand, message still unsent. Around them, the city continued its nighttime rhythm, cars passing by, distant sirens, the constant hum of urban life. But in this small bubble of space beside the Honda Civic, two men were wrestling with questions of loyalty, justice, and the price of doing what you believe is right. Get back in your patrol car, Mendez said finally. Write me the ticket and let me go. Santos waited, not moving toward his car. The message? Mendez looked down at his phone, then back up at Santos. I need to think about this. I need to think about what's right. He paused. But Miguel, or Mike, or whoever you really are, this doesn't end here. People deserve to know who you really are. Santos nodded slowly. He walked back to his patrol car, wrote the speeding ticket with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be, and handed it to Carlos Mendez. As the Honda drove away into the night, Santos sat in his patrol car and realized that his life as he knew it might be over. Because somewhere in the city, Carlos Mendez was deciding whether or not to pull the trigger on 3 years of secrets. Santos didn't go back to the station that night. Instead, he drove to the 24-hour diner on 5th Street where cops went when they needed to think without anyone asking questions. The same diner where he'd met his handler during the undercover operation, where they'd planned raids and discussed intelligence over coffee that tasted like motor oil. He ordered black coffee and sat in the back booth, the same one where Detective Lieutenant Sarah Chen had first approached him about going undercover 3.5 years ago. She'd been direct about the risks. This isn't TV, Santos. You go deep enough to matter, and parts of you might not come back. And if your cover gets blown, the department can only protect you so much. Now, staring at his reflection in the diner window, Santos wondered if this was what she'd meant. Not just the physical danger of exposure, but the psychological weight of living a lie so completely that you sometimes forgot where the character ended and you began. His phone buzzed. Text message from an unknown number, still thinking about our conversation. Haven't decided anything yet. But you should know, Eddie's getting out next month. Early release. Might want to consider a vacation. Santos closed his eyes and let out a slow breath. Eddie Mendez, Carlos's cousin, the mid-level dealer who had trusted Miguel Rodriguez enough to bring him into the organization. Eddie, who was facing 25 years until Santos's testimony helped prosecutors build a case that led to a plea deal. 15 years instead of 25, and now he was getting out even earlier. Another text, he still talks about Miguel like family. Asks about you every time we visit. Says he can't wait to see you again when he gets out. Santos deleted both messages and tried to focus on his coffee, but his hands were shaking slightly. Eddie Mendez wasn't just a dealer, he was smart, connected, and had a reputation for taking care of problems personally. If Eddie found out that Miguel Rodriguez was the reason for his 15 years in prison. The diner door chimed, and Detective Chen walked in. She spotted Santos immediately and slid into the booth across from him without being invited. Rough night, she asked, signaling the waitress for coffee. How did you know I was here? Same place you always came when the job got too heavy. Besides, dispatch said you've been off the radio for 2 hours after a routine traffic stop. That usually means something went wrong. Santos studied her face, trying to figure out how much to tell her. Chen had been his handler during the undercover operation, the only person in the department who knew the full scope of what Miguel Rodriguez had accomplished. She'd also been the one to pull him out when the operation was compromised, not by his cover being blown, but by Santos himself, who had started showing signs of psychological strain after 3 years of living a double life. Someone recognized me, Santos said finally. Chen's coffee arrived, and she took a sip before responding. From the operation? Carlos Mendez. Eddie's cousin. I pulled him over for speeding, and he recognized my voice. Did he make any calls? Send any messages? Not yet. He's thinking about it. Chen nodded slowly, her expression giving away nothing. This was why she'd made lieutenant before 40, she could process bad news without panic, analyze threats without emotion. How much does he know? She asked. Everything. He knows Miguel Rodriguez was a fake identity. He knows I'm a cop. He knows his cousin is in prison because of evidence I gathered. And he knows Eddie gets out next month. Santos looked up sharply. You knew about that? I keep tabs on all the major arrests from the operation. Eddie Mendez, Luis Vargas, Tommy Chen. I know when they're scheduled for release, where they're likely to go, who they're likely to contact. She paused. It's part of making sure our people stay safe. Our people? You think you're the only undercover officer whose cover might get blown someday? You think the Rodriguez operation was the only one we've run in the city? Chen leaned forward. Santos, there are at least 6 active undercover operations running right now. Officers who have been deep for months or years, building cases against people who would kill them without hesitation if they knew the truth. Your exposure doesn't just threaten you, it threatens all of them. Santos hadn't considered that. He'd been so focused on his own danger, his own guilt, that he hadn't thought about the broader implications. If Carlos Mendez decided to expose one undercover cop, it would make everyone in the criminal community more suspicious, more careful, more likely to test the people around them. What are my options? Santos asked. Chen sipped her coffee, thinking. Officially? We can offer you witness protection. New identity, relocation to another state, federal marshals keeping an eye on you for the first few years. Unofficially? Unofficially, we can try to manage the situation. Carlos Mendez isn't a career criminal, he's a kid who got caught up in his family's business. Maybe he can be reasoned with. Maybe he'll decide that keeping quiet is better for everyone, including his own family. And if he doesn't? Chen met his eyes across the table. Then we have a problem. Because Eddie Mendez isn't going to be satisfied with just knowing that Miguel Rodriguez was a cop. He's going to want revenge. And he's going to want it to be public enough that other people think twice before they cooperate with police. Santos's phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number. Talk to my sister. She remembers you playing with her kids at family barbecues. Says you were always good to our family. That has to count for something, right? He showed the message to Chen, who read it without expression. He's conflicted, she said. That's good. Conflicted people can be reasoned with. Or they can be unpredictable. True. Chen finished her coffee and slid out of the booth. I'm going to make some calls, see what our options are. In the meantime, Santos, I need you to stay visible. Go to work tomorrow, act normal, don't do anything that suggests you're preparing to run. If Carlos Mendez decides to reach out again, I want him to think that you're confident enough in your safety that you're not changing your routine. And if Eddie Mendez finds out before we can resolve this? Chen paused at the edge of the booth. Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But Santos? If this goes bad, if your cover gets blown completely, remember that Miguel Rodriguez might have lied about who he was, but the work he did was real. The drugs he helped get off the street, the dealers he helped put in prison, the kids who didn't die because of the intelligence he gathered, that was real too. After she left, Santos sat alone in the diner, watching the sun come up over a city that suddenly felt a lot more dangerous than it had 12 hours ago. Santos went to work the next day as if nothing had happened. He checked in with dispatch, responded to calls, wrote reports, and maintained the facade of a routine patrol officer going about his duties. But every time his radio crackled, every time a car approached his patrol vehicle, every time his phone buzzed with a text message, his heart rate spiked. The uncertainty was worse than knowing. If Carlos Mendez had decided to expose him, Santos would have preferred to know immediately rather than spend days waiting for the other shoe to drop. At least then he could prepare, make arrangements, say goodbye to people who mattered. But the silence stretched on. No threatening messages, no reports of unusual activity in the neighborhoods where Miguel Rodriguez had operated, no indication that word was spreading through the criminal networks that had once trusted him. It was during his lunch break, sitting in his patrol car outside a sandwich shop, that his phone finally rang. Unknown number, but he recognized it from the text messages. This is Santos. It's Carlos. We need to talk. Okay. Where? You remember the park on Elm Street? Where you used to meet my cousin when he wanted to talk business away from the house. Santos remembered. Lincoln Park, with its playground and basketball courts, always busy enough that two men talking wouldn't attract attention, but open enough that nobody could approach without being seen. I remember. 1 hour. Come alone, and Santos? Don't bring any backup. I'm not trying to hurt you, but if I see other cops, I'm going to assume the worst. The line went dead. Santos sat in his car for a few minutes, weighing his options. He could call Chen, set up surveillance, Make sure there were officers positioned around the park in case things went wrong. But Carlos had been clear about coming alone, and Santos's gut told him that this wasn't a setup for violence. If Carlos Mendez wanted him dead, there were easier ways to make that happen. An hour later, Santos was walking through Lincoln Park in civilian clothes, having finished his shift early and changed out of his uniform. He found Carlos sitting on a bench near the playground, watching kids climb on the jungle gym while their parents chatted nearby. "My nephew plays here sometimes," Carlos said as Santos sat down beside him. "Little guy, 7 years old. Smart as hell, wants to be a doctor when he grows up." Santos waited, understanding that this conversation would move at Carlos's pace. "I've been thinking about what you said. About how sending that message would hurt innocent people." Carlos turned to look at Santos. "But I've also been thinking about all the people who got hurt because of what you did as Miguel Rodriguez." "I know." "Do you?" "Because it's easy to say you know, but I'm not sure you really understand what it was like for the families. My cousin Eddie's wife had to move back in with her parents when he got arrested. Couldn't afford the rent on her own. His kids ask about their dad every day, and she has to explain why he's not coming home." Santos felt the familiar weight of guilt settling on his chest. "I never wanted innocent people to get hurt. But you knew they would. You knew that when you arrested the dealers, it wouldn't just affect them. It would affect their families, their kids, their communities. And I also knew that leaving the dealers alone would keep hurting innocent people too. Kids getting hooked on drugs, families destroyed by addiction, violence spreading through neighborhoods where people were afraid to leave their houses at night." Carlos was quiet for a long moment, watching his nephew climb across the monkey bars with the determined concentration that only 7-year-olds could manage. "My sister asked me something yesterday," Carlos said. "She asked if I thought Miguel Rodriguez was a bad person." "What did you tell her?" "I told her I didn't know. Because the Miguel Rodriguez who came to family dinners and played with our kids seemed like a good guy. But the Miguel Rodriguez who was gathering evidence to put our family in prison. I don't know what to think about him." Santos understood the confusion because he'd lived it from the other side. There had been moments during the operation when his affection for these families had been genuine, when he'd wanted to warn them about impending arrests, when he'd felt like a monster for betraying people who had welcomed him into their homes. "Carlos," Santos said carefully, "what if I told you that both versions were real? What if Miguel Rodriguez wasn't just a character I was playing, but a part of me that actually cared about your family? Then I'd say you're either lying to yourself or you're a psychopath. Because people who care about families don't destroy them. People who care about families try to protect them from things that are destroying them from the inside." Carlos stood up abruptly, anger flashing across his face. "Don't you dare try to make this about protecting us. You weren't protecting anyone but yourself and your career." Santos remained seated, keeping his voice calm. "You're right. Part of it was about my career. Part of it was about following orders. But part of it was also about seeing what drugs were doing to neighborhoods like yours and wanting to do something about it. By lying to us. By gathering evidence against people who were poisoning their own communities." They stared at each other for a moment, the tension thick between them. Finally, Carlos sat back down, rubbing his face with his hands. "I don't know what the right thing to do is," he said. "I really don't. Part of me wants to tell everyone who you are because they deserve to know. Part of me wants to protect you because, regardless of what you did, I remember you being kind to my family. What's stopping you from deciding?" Carlos pulled out his phone and showed Santos a photo. It was Eddie Mendez in his prison uniform, smiling at the camera during a recent visit. "He still talks about Miguel Rodriguez like you were his brother. Says he can't wait to introduce you to his kids when he gets out. Says you're going to be the best man at his daughter's quinceañera next year." Carlos put the phone away. How do I tell him that his brother was the person who put him in prison? Santos felt something break inside his chest. He'd known intellectually that Eddie thought of Miguel Rodriguez as family, but seeing the genuine affection in that photo made it real in a way that was almost unbearable. "I don't know," Santos said honestly. "I don't know how you tell him that. I don't know how I live with knowing that. But Carlos, if you tell him the truth, it's not just going to break his heart. It's going to get people killed." "Maybe," Carlos said. "Or maybe people deserve to know who they can really trust." 3 days passed without word from Carlos Mendez. Santos went through the motions of his job, responding to calls, writing reports, maintaining the careful normalcy that Chen had insisted upon. But the waiting was wearing on him. Every shadow seemed threatening, every unfamiliar car potentially dangerous, every phone call a possible harbinger of disaster. It was during his Thursday evening shift that everything changed. Santos was responding to a domestic disturbance call in the same neighborhood where Miguel Rodriguez had once operated when he saw a familiar figure standing on a street corner. Eddie Mendez, wearing civilian clothes, looking around as if he was waiting for someone. Santos felt his blood turn to ice. Eddie wasn't supposed to be out for another 3 weeks. Early release could happen, but not without notice to the department. Unless... His radio crackled, "All units, be advised we have reports of an armed robbery in progress at the convenience store on Oak and 3rd. Suspect is described as Hispanic male, approximately 25 years old, wearing a dark jacket." Oak and 3rd was 2 blocks from where Santos was currently parked. 2 blocks from where Eddie Mendez was standing on the corner. Santos made a decision that would have horrified his training officers. Instead of responding to the robbery call, he drove directly toward Eddie. As he approached, Eddie turned and saw the patrol car. For a moment, the 2 men just looked at each other through the windshield. Then Eddie smiled, the same warm, genuine smile that Santos remembered from 100 family gatherings, and walked toward the car. Santos rolled down his window, his hand instinctively moving toward his weapon. "Miguel," Eddie called out, his voice filled with joy and recognition. "Man, what are you doing in that uniform? Carlos said he saw you the other night, but I thought he was messing with me." Santos stared at Eddie Mendez, trying to process what was happening. Eddie didn't seem angry or suspicious. He seemed genuinely happy to see Miguel Rodriguez, even though Miguel Rodriguez was wearing a police uniform. "Eddie," Santos said carefully. "What are you doing out? I thought you had 3 more weeks. Good behavior, man. They let me out early. First thing I wanted to do was track down my boy Miguel and see what's been going on." Eddie's expression shifted slightly, becoming more curious. "But seriously, what's with the cop car? You working some kind of undercover thing?" Santos felt the world tilt on its axis. Eddie thought Miguel Rodriguez was an undercover criminal working within the police department. The possibility that Miguel Rodriguez was actually an undercover cop working within the criminal community hadn't even occurred to him. "Eddie," Santos said slowly, "we need to talk." "Damn right we need to talk. I've got 3 years of stories to catch up on, and you've got some explaining to do about this police thing." Eddie's smile faltered slightly. "Please tell me you're not going straight on me, Miguel. Please tell me you didn't find religion or something while I was locked up." Santos realized he was at a crossroads that would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of everyone involved in this tangled web of identities and loyalties. He could maintain the fiction that Miguel Rodriguez was a criminal working undercover within the police. He could continue the lie that had defined 3 years of his life. Or he could tell the truth and face whatever consequences followed. His radio crackled again. "Unit 247, respond to Oak and 3rd for the robbery in progress." "I have to take this call," Santos said to Eddie. "But we definitely need to talk. Can you meet me later?" "Of course, man." "Where?" Santos gave him the address of the diner on 5th Street. "Midnight. I'll explain everything then." Eddie nodded and stepped back from the patrol car. As Santos drove toward the robbery call, he caught sight of Eddie in his rearview mirror, still standing on the corner, still smiling. The robbery at the convenience store turned out to be a false alarm. A customer arguing with the clerk over the price of cigarettes had been misinterpreted by a passerby as a holdup. But as Santos filled out the incident report, his mind was elsewhere, trying to figure out how to handle the impossible situation he'd found himself in. At 11:45 p.m., Santos walked into the diner on 5th Street and found Eddie Mendez already there, sitting in the same back booth where Santos had met with Chen just days earlier. Eddie had ordered coffee and was reading a newspaper, looking relaxed and happy in a way that made Santos's heart ache. "Miguel." Eddie stood up and embraced Santos like a brother, the kind of hug that spoke of genuine affection and shared history. "Man, you look good. Being a cop suits you." Santos sat down across from Eddie, trying to find the words for what he needed to say. "So," Eddie said, settling back into his seat, "tell me everything. How long have you been working this police angle? Are you gathering intelligence for the family? Because if you are, that's brilliant, man. Having someone on the inside of the department could be incredibly valuable." Santos looked at Eddie's face, open, trusting, excited to reconnect with someone he considered family, and realized that there was no way to tell this story that wouldn't destroy everything Eddie believed about loyalty, friendship, and trust. "Eddie," Santos said slowly, "Miguel Rodriguez isn't real." Eddie's smile faded slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean Miguel Rodriguez was a cover identity. I'm Detective Mike Santos. I've been a police officer for 8 years. The last 3 years, I was working undercover in your organization." The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Santos watched as understanding dawned in Eddie's eyes, first confusion, then disbelief, then a pain so deep it was almost unbearable to witness. "You're telling me," Eddie said very quietly, "that Miguel Rodriguez, the guy who was like a brother to me, who I trusted with my life, who I brought into my family, was a cop the whole time." Yes. And everything I told you, everything I shared with you, everything I trusted you with, you were recording it? Using it against me? Yes. Eddie sat back in the booth as if he'd been physically struck. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. The evidence that put me in prison. That came from you. Some of it, yes. Eddie closed his eyes and was quiet for a long moment. When he opened them again, Santos saw something there that he'd never seen before, a cold, calculating anger that made him understand why Eddie Mendez had been one of the most feared men in the organization. You know what the worst part is? Eddie said. It's not that you were a cop. It's not even that you lied to me for 3 years. It's that I still want to think of you as my brother. The silence in the diner stretched between them like a chasm that couldn't be crossed. Santos watched Eddie process the revelation, seeing the war playing out across his face, anger, betrayal, hurt, and something that looked almost like grief. 15 years, Eddie said finally. I lost 15 years of my life because someone I loved like family was gathering evidence against me. Eddie, don't. Eddie held up a hand. Don't try to justify it. Don't tell me it was just your job. Don't tell me you didn't have a choice. You had a choice every single day for 3 years, and every day you chose to betray people who trusted you. Santos nodded, accepting the anger because it was deserved. You're right. Am I? Because part of me still doesn't want to believe it. Part of me still remembers Miguel Rodriguez holding my daughter when she was 2 years old, teaching her how to play peekaboo. Part of me remembers you staying up all night with me when my mother was in the hospital, not saying much but just being there. Eddie's voice cracked slightly. Was any of that real, or was it all just part of your cover? The question hit Santos harder than any accusation could have. It was real, he said quietly. The affection, the friendship, the way I felt about your family, that was all real. Miguel Rodriguez might have been a fake identity, but the emotions weren't fake. Then how? Eddie demanded. How do you care about someone and then destroy their life? How do you hold someone's child and then send their father to prison? Santos had asked himself the same questions 1,000 times during sleepless nights after the operation ended. Because I also saw what the drugs were doing to other children. Other families. And I had to choose between betraying people I cared about and watching more kids die from overdoses. So you chose to be God. You chose who deserved to suffer and who deserved to be saved. I chose to do my job. Eddie laughed bitterly. Your job. Right. He pulled out his phone and showed Santos a picture, his daughter, now 18, in a graduation cap and gown. You want to know what your job cost? My daughter graduated high school last month. Valedictorian. Full scholarship to college. And I wasn't there because I was in prison, thanks to evidence gathered by someone she called Uncle Miguel. Santos stared at the photo, remembering the toddler who had fallen asleep in his arms during family barbecues. Eddie, I'm sorry. I know that doesn't mean anything, but I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't give me back 15 years. Sorry doesn't let me walk my daughter down the aisle someday without explaining why I missed most of her childhood. Eddie put the phone away. But you know what's really messed up? I'm not here to hurt you. Santos looked up, surprised. Carlos told me he saw you. Told me he was thinking about exposing you to everyone. And you know what my first thought was? I thought about Miguel Rodriguez teaching my daughter to ride a bike. I thought about you sitting with me at my mother's funeral. And I realized that even after everything, even knowing what you did, I still don't want to see you die. Eddie, but here's the thing, Miguel. Or Mike. Or whoever you really are. I can't protect you anymore. Word is already spreading. People are starting to ask questions about why a cop looks so much like Miguel Rodriguez. And there are people in the organization who weren't as fond of Miguel as I was. People who are going to want revenge when they find out the truth. Santos felt his stomach drop. How long do I have? Maybe a week. Maybe less. Luis Vargas got out last month too, and he's been asking around about Miguel Rodriguez. When he figures out who you really are. Eddie shrugged. Luis doesn't have the same sentimental feelings about you that I do. Santos remembered Luis Vargas, Eddie's lieutenant, a man who solved problems with violence and asked questions later. If Luis was looking for Miguel Rodriguez, Santos was living on borrowed time. What do I do? Santos asked. Eddie stood up from the booth. You disappear. Tonight. You take whatever money you've saved, and you run as far and as fast as you can. Maybe the federal marshals can protect you, maybe they can't. But staying here is suicide. Eddie, I want you to know. Don't. Eddie's voice was firm but not unkind. Don't try to explain it again. Don't try to make it better. Just accept that you made choices, and those choices have consequences. For you, for me, for everyone who got caught up in this mess. Eddie started to walk away, then turned back. Miguel Rodriguez was a good man, he said quietly. He was loyal, he was kind, and he genuinely cared about people. It's too bad he never really existed. After Eddie left, Santos sat alone in the diner, staring at his reflection in the window. In the glass, he could see both versions of himself, Officer Mike Santos and the ghost of Miguel Rodriguez, and for the first time in months, he wasn't sure which one was real. His phone buzzed with a text from Detective Chen. "Safe house is ready. Car will pick you up at your apartment in 2 hours. Pack light." Santos typed back, "Understood." But as he walked out of the diner and into the night, Santos realized that no matter how far he ran or how well the marshals protected him, he would never really escape what he'd done. Because Miguel Rodriguez might have been a lie, but the love he'd felt for Eddie's family was real. The trust he'd betrayed was real. And the guilt he would carry for the rest of his life was real too. 6 months later, Detective Mike Santos was living in Portland, Oregon, under a new name, working as a security guard at a shopping mall. He didn't carry a gun anymore, didn't wear a badge, didn't have the authority to arrest anyone. But sometimes, late at night, he would think about a little girl who had called him Uncle Miguel, and wonder if she ever asked about him. And sometimes he would remember Eddie Mendez saying that Miguel Rodriguez was a good man who never really existed, and wonder if maybe that was the most honest thing anyone had ever said about him. The truth was that undercover work changes you in ways that can't be undone. You become someone else so completely that pieces of your original self get lost forever. And sometimes, when the operation is over and you try to go back to who you were before, you discover that person doesn't exist anymore either. Miguel Rodriguez was dead. Officer Mike Santos was in witness protection. And the man living in Portland under a new name was someone else entirely, someone carrying the memories of both identities and the guilt of choices that couldn't be undone. But late at night, when he couldn't sleep, he would sometimes catch himself humming the lullaby that Miguel Rodriguez used to sing to Eddie's daughter. And in those moments, he would remember that even lies can contain truth, even betrayal can coexist with love, and even the most necessary choices can break your heart. So now I ask you, have you ever known someone who carried secrets that defined their life? Someone who made choices that saved some people while hurting others? Share their story in the comments, because here at Silent Heroes, we believe that the most complex stories are often the most human ones. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who understands that heroism isn't always clean, that doing the right thing isn't always clear, and that sometimes the people who protect us carry burdens we'll never fully understand. We'll see you in the next story. And remember, the line between hero and betrayer is sometimes thinner than we'd like to admit, and the people walking that line deserve our understanding, even when they don't deserve our forgiveness.